Well, hello. You are a forensic custody evaluator, and I'm Dr. Childress. And you've been asked by a parent to watch this video from me to describe what the parent needs. And they are a court involved parent in significant custody conflict. And so they've asked you to watch this video for me to provide a professional level discussion of what they're asking for and what the court needs in their situation. So I very much appreciate you taking the time here to respond to your parents' request. So first off, I am speaking to forensic custody evaluators, and there's a parent, as I said, who's involved in court-involved custody conflict, who's asked you to watch this video from me to explain at a professional level what they need. The court order that they either have obtained or are seeking to obtain through their attorney has ordered a clinical diagnostic assessment of the family conflict that's examining for a particular type of diagnosis. And you're being asked to participate in that or be involved in that because you work in the family courts and you're comfortable working in the family courts. The clinical psychologists who are outside of the courts don't work in the family courts, and they decline to assist this client family because of their court involvement. And so as a result, the parent in this situation cannot locate a clinical psychologist to conduct a proper assessment because clinical psychologists don't work in the family courts. And so the parent and the court are asking you to conduct the clinical diagnostic assessment for the diagnoses of concern. The parent who's approaching you wants you to conduct the court-ordered clinical diagnostic assessment for a particular group of diagnoses. And the court and the parent don't need a forensic custody evaluation. They need a clinical diagnostic assessment for a particular potential diagnosis that's in the family. And the diagnosis of concern is a thought disorder, persecutory delusion, and child psychological abuse. So we're talking child abuse in this situation. So the differential diagnosis that's involved and that the court would like assessed and the parent would like assessed is child abuse by one parent or the other. And essentially, for the targeted parent, the concern is child abuse in some form that's resulting in the child's attachment pathology, the child rejecting a parent, seeking to flee a parent. And so is a targeted parent abusing the child in some way? That might be physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect abuse, or psychological abuse. And just the child's symptoms of trying to get away from the parent would suggest that there's some sort of abusive range parenting, but that may not actually be true. And so that's what we would like assessed in this situation. With the differential diagnosis, if the targeted parent is not abusing the child in some way, then the differential diagnosis is that it's the allied parent who's psychologically abusing the child by creating a persecutory delusion shared, and there's your DSM-5 diagnosis 297.1, and a false or factitious attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain to the parent, and that's a factitious disorder imposed on another, 300.19. And either one or both of those is going to be child psychological abuse. And then the fourth diagnosis of concern for the allied parent is that it's possible spouse or partner abuse, psychological abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent, using the child and the child's induced pathology as the spousal abuse weapon. So that's the differential diagnosis that is of clinical concern with this family. And we need that diagnosis to then guide treatment based on what's coming back. What is the diagnosis for the family? And that's where I said earlier that the parents in the courts can't get that differential diagnostic assessment from the clinical psychologist because they don't work in the family courts. And you work in the family courts, but you conduct custody evaluations, and that's not what's needed. So you're being asked to, because of your involvement as a forensic psychologist in the family courts, you're being asked to expand your role to be able to conduct the clinical diagnostic assessment that the court needs and that for its decision making and that the parent needs and the treatment providers need for their treatment. So one of the concerns, though, is that the assessment of delusional thought disorders and factitious disorder, attachment pathology, um, that that's may be beyond the scope of your background and training as a forensic custody evaluator. So you may not feel comfortable conducting a clinical diagnostic assessment for a persecutory thought disorder and factitious disorder and the attachment pathology. However, this family in the court has no one else to turn to because the clinical people don't work in the family courts. The ones who could diagnose a delusional thought disorder are overworking in schizophrenia. And very few people have factitious disorder, and very few people have attachment pathology in their background. And so we're asking you as a court-involved psychologist to expand your role into conducting this clinical diagnostic assessment for the court and for the family. So the fundamental feature off of this is that because you are a court-involved psychologist, the parent and the court are asking you to provide the needed clinical diagnostic services to this court-involved family. But because that may be a little bit outside of your professional scope of practice, the relevant ethical standard is Standard 2.01, Boundaries of Competence, Section D, that says when psychologists are asked to provide services to individuals for whom appropriate mental health services are not available, and that's the case here. We cannot get a clinical diagnostic assessment of the pathology because no clinical psychologists work in the family courts. And so appropriate mental health services are not available, and for which psychologists, you as a custody evaluator, have not been obtained the competence necessary. Psychologists with closely related prior training or experience, and that would be your category, that you work in the family courts, you've been working with these high conflict families, and that's closely related prior training and experience, even if you don't have direct experience with assessing delusional thought disorders or factitious attachment pathology, those sorts of things. So you have the closely related prior training or experience that allows you to provide such services in order to ensure that the services are not denied if you make a reasonable effort to obtain competence required using relevant research, training, and consultation or study. And that's the role that's going to be coming forward, is that you will have some consultation support in this diagnosis. So the parent and the attorney will provide you with a court order appointing you to conduct the clinical diagnostic assessment for the family and for further treatment if you agree to that. We would like the treatment, you to accept the treatment role, but if you want to limit your role to just the assessment diagnosis, that's fine. We can get treatment once we get the diagnosis. So you can, that's negotiable, is whether you are participating in the full treatment process, of which the diagnosis is the first part, or whether you're limiting your role to just a diagnostic assessment. And the court order that you're going to be provided with will also allow each parent to appoint a second opinion consultant of their choice to participate through telehealth in the assessment sessions. So you will have one, perhaps two, consulting psychologists to collaborate and support the return diagnosis. And that's because any diagnosis that's returned into the legal system is going to be a disputed diagnosis. One parent or the other is going to dispute that. And if you say it's child abuse by the targeted parent, they're going to say no. If you say it's psychological abuse by the allied parent, they're going to say no. And so it's going to be a disputed diagnosis. And the appellate system in healthcare for a disputed diagnosis is second opinion. And so in healthcare, we pull our second opinions up early and often because we need an accurate diagnosis early so that we can begin the treatment. And so that's what's going to be provided here is that each parent will be allowed to appoint a second opinion consultant. So we form basically a treatment team around the child to return the diagnosis and then to move into treatment. So the parent and the court would like you to be the treatment provider, with the diagnostic assessment that's rendered within a consulting treatment team being the first part of that treatment. So we'd like you to take on the role of the treatment provider because you're familiar with court-involved pathology, and then to get the support from the two consultants for each appointed by each of the litigants to render the accurate diagnosis that will then move into your treatment. And throughout healthcare, diagnosis guides treatment. And so you might be concerned about, what's my role, a forensic role or a treatment role? We would like you for the treatment role, and that the diagnostic assessment is the first part of that because diagnosis guides treatment. And then we'll get you support on that. But if you want to limit your role just down to the forensic evaluation part or the forensic clinical diagnostic assessment of the pathology and then allow somebody else to do the treatment, we can accept that because we need the diagnosis. This is potential child abuse, and the court needs accurate information about whether there's a delusional thought disorder, which parent's abusing the child for its decision making. And then we need to get treatment for whatever that diagnosis is. So that's up to you, sort of, in terms of your agreement and comfort level. Fundamentally, what we need is a diagnostic risk assessment for child abuse, and it needs to be conducted to the differential diagnoses of concern for each parent that will render an accurate diagnosis for the court's decision making surrounding the child. And here's the National Academies of Sciences talking about the role of consultation in improving diagnosis in healthcare. So they say clinicians may refer to or consult with other clinicians formally or informally to seek additional expertise about a patient's health problems. The consult may help to confirm or reject the working diagnosis or may provide information on potential treatment options, and that's the role of the consultants here to help confirm or reject the working diagnosis and potentially to provide additional consultation and support for the treatment. Clinicians can also recommend that a patient seek a second opinion from another clinician to verify impressions of an uncertain diagnosis or if they believe that this would be helpful to the patient. So as a clinical psychologist or as a psychologist, you're well familiar with consultations among doctors within healthcare. So if you are interested in just the diagnostic assessment role, this is a depiction of what that would look like. So we have two litigants. Litigant one is saying it's child abuse by the targeted parent. Litigant two is saying it's child abuse by the allied parent. So they have competing allegations that the other parent is abusing the child in some way. So we're going to move this into a clinical diagnostic assessment to get that answered to the differential diagnoses of concern, and then the court will allow each of the litigants to appoint a second opinion consultant to participate in that through telehealth. So you'll have collaborative discussions and work together on coming back with the diagnosis, although you will be the primary report coming into the court, and then the two consultants will offer their consulting reports. And then based on that clinical diagnosis that's returned and the reports coming in, to the court can then make its decisions that it has to make regarding the custody situation. And then that will move into the treatment plan to fix whatever the diagnosed problem is in the family. The other way to look at this, and my preferred approach, would be if you were to accept the treatment role. So you're experienced in court-involved pathology, but we're not asking you to be in that forensic role. We're asking you to be in the treatment provider role. And the first part of any treatment is to diagnose what the problem is. And because this is court-involved and it'll be a disputed diagnosis, each litigant is allowed to appoint a second opinion that participates in the diagnostic assessment, that information then goes back to the court for its decision making and then extends out into treatment. And then each of the consultants would be available to support you in the further treatment because they were involved in the assessment as well. And so it creates a treatment team around the family of a primary provider and then the consultation support for the diagnosis and the treatment plan. And one of the really fundamental things we need to do in the family courts is to end the fighting around these children. And we want to stop years of litigation and custody conflict and everybody fighting and fighting psychologists and fighting experts and everybody. So we need to get that accurate diagnosis early. Which parent is abusing the child? So we can get it on an effective treatment plan to fix it. And so that's what we're seeking to do in this situation by providing that initial treatment team on the assessment and diagnosis of the problem that can then result in an effective treatment plan. So if you want to know more about me or my work, I would suggest logging in or following me on Blue Sky. I post fairly regularly just information about the diagnosis of the pathology in the family courts and approaches to resolving it. And then if you want to contact me directly, there's my email that you can do that. I also have some videos up. I have a diagnostic series up on YouTube. And so you may be interested in watching the DSM-5 diagnosis of family court pathology. I have another video seminar up on diagnosing a persecutory delusion. And I have another one up on diagnosing a factitious disorder imposed on the child, as well as other in the diagnostic series, such as assessing parenting and things. So lots of information up on my YouTube site. But those may be of interest to you if you're willing. And I appreciate your taking the time for me to explain what the pathology or what the issues are in the family courts and what you're being asked to do in this situation. And if there's any other help I can provide in this case or any case, or because I'm just providing this just generally on the YouTube, so I don't know who the parent is who asks you to watch this. So if you just want to talk about a case or consult on a case, you feel free to get a hold of me and we can talk about the situation. These parents and the court cannot get a diagnostic assessment for possible child abuse because the clinical psychologists don't work here and the forensic custody evaluators are doing custody evaluations, not clinical diagnostic assessments. So we need to resolve that situation. This is possible child abuse and possible spousal abuse of the targeted parent. And so we need to get an accurate diagnosis on this. Duty to protect obligations are active, and we need to protect the child from one parent or the other. Just need to decide which parent it is. So thanks again on behalf of the parent and on behalf of me for taking the time to listen to this. So with that, take care.